For those of you who are visiting, you know how crazy the pastor is when he wears a big cowboy hat. We are here during the Advent season, and Christmas, of course, is a special time of anticipation, joy, and celebration. It's a celebration of the salvation God has brought to His people in the past, and it's an anticipation of His second coming. That's what we do during Advent. Now, one of the universal images that we have during Christmas time is shepherds watching their sheep by night. Now, the main purpose of that, all of us know, is that when they're out on the mountain ranges, sheep are being very docile, are subject to being preyed on by wolves, mountain lions, bears, whatever comes through. And so the shepherds then would actually watch over the flocks by night, and they would protect them. And it is that image of watching over things that came to me, and I was with the proverb writer in Proverbs 4:23, where it says to guard your heart, or keep your heart with all vigilance. And the reason for that is that out of our heart is the wellspring of life. And so this year, my Christmas series has been more of a devotional nature and less of an expository or an encouraging behavior. Just something to pick up on that image of watching, guarding your heart, watching things. And now 2 weeks ago, we took a look at the announcement of the births of John the Baptist and Jesus, and saw how that affected our faith. Today, I want to pick up on, I want to look at the birth of Jesus. I'm caught up here. For those of you who are here, you'll have to understand, I wasn't here last week. And every time I get away, you have to retrain me.
We know that.
And so the congregation is just kind of tolerating what's happening, as I try and get back and figure out what's going on around here and get into the rhythm that we had. But this week, what I'd like to do, I'd like to focus on Jesus' birth. And I don't want to talk so much about the facts of it or whatever. What I want to focus on is the virtues that were demonstrated by it, specifically the virtues of simplicity and humility. So let's take a look at the story itself. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. Now, this was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone went to his own town to register. And so Joseph went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him, and was expecting a child. And while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths, placed him in a manger because there was no room for him in the inn. When we begin to look at Jesus, we're talking about God coming from heaven to earth. And the minute I say that, what we would expect is a birth in a castle. I mean, you know what happens when they have the royal weddings and there's a birth in the castle. I mean, the fanfare and the trumpets and the pageantry that follows that. You would think that that would be a minimum for the Son of God coming into the world, but it wasn't. It wasn't what we expect, because first of all, he was born in a barn. Now, when I wrote that in my notes, you know exactly what went through my head. My mother saying to me, "John, shut that door. Were you born in a barn?" And Jesus would stand up and say, "Well, as a matter of fact, I was." But he was born in a barn. Now, in all fairness, sometimes we try. It says there was no room for him in the inn. We kind of read that through our 21st century lens. In the first century, inns were not what we have today, where you had a private room or anything. Basically, they were a courtyard. And you would come out there and you would lay your mats on the ground and you would sleep on the ground where it was. And if you had any privacy at all, you just erected a few curtains, and it was noisy, hardly private. And when you begin thinking about a woman bearing a child, certainly not the kind, it's almost a circus atmosphere, certainly not a place you would want them. And so, in all fairness, with Mary being born in a manger, or with Jesus being born taken to a barn, at least it was quiet, and at least it was a bit private. And so, having said that, it was sheltered that way, but it was still a barn, And even under the best of circumstances, it was just a barn with a feed trough for a crib. That's pretty simple. Pretty high. That's the way Jesus came. Now, I think what I want to reflect on here is God's in control of how Jesus comes to earth. Okay? And I find it instructive when he came, when he's in charge, he's got it, he comes humbly and simply, not with all the trappings. Let's talk a little bit about simplicity. Simplicity is simply simplifying one's life to focus on the most important thing. We live in a complex, busy world. I don't know about you, but I find myself being pulled by a lot of different things. I have family commitments, I have church commitments, I have things that I need to do, things that need to be fixed, stuff that needs to be done, and I find myself simply just almost overwhelmed at times with the sheer busyness of living. The virtue of simplicity is a Christian discipline. And it is a discipline that takes all of this and simply focuses on the most important thing and allows everything else to fall in line behind it. When we start talking about simplicity, we have to realize that this is an inward discipline that has outward implications. Simplicity starts in here. where we begin taking a look at what's most important and allowing ourselves as Christians to discipline ourselves to have one thing and one thing only as our primary goal, thing that sets our priorities, one center. They often refer to it among the mystics, they refer to it as a center, that we work out of a center in our life, and that those simple things are there. Now these inward disciplines then, when you do that, when you settle what is most important and whatever, then it begins to have implications on the outside. The way you live, the way you talk, the way you spend your money, what you desire, it affects those kind of things. Now when we start talking about simplicity, primarily and mostly we're talking about the accumulation of wealth. But what happens when you have this center and you live simply, it also affects your words. You become just honest. Okay? It's just there, you know, whatever it is. There's no need for more words. There's no need to cover up. There's no things and things like that. It just becomes this simple honesty. It affects our desires. We begin to take a look at things, and we begin to see things in a different light. It talks about our commitments. I know I have struggled throughout my life with being overcommitted. Have you had that problem? Just being overcommitted. And it's so, especially as a pastor, because you know, you've got things at the church, you want to do things, you want to please people, you want to help people, you want to do all those things, and you can make commitments and make commitments and make commitments to the point that you are so overcommitted that you don't have time, hardly, to read and pray. Okay? And so simplicity has to do with the commitments we make. And of course, our lifestyle. We have so many things that we don't realize how much time taking care of our things takes. Remember a story Jim Dobson told one time, that he and his wife wanted this clock. And when they got the clock, it wasn't right. It was broken. And after they fiddled with it for several hours, they finally boxed it up, sent it back to the company, which took a lot of time on the phone, sent it back to the company to get it fixed. They got it back, they hung it up, it worked for a little while, and then the clock quit working and they had to call it back and back. He said, do you realize the number of hours we spent just trying to take care of this clock? And I know myself. Whenever I have to get on the phone to Verizon, you just block out the next 2 hours. You know, 1 hour and 50 minutes of which is listening to elevator music that's ugly music and loud in the ear, you know. But just trying to keep things fixed. And so what we do when we try and simplify our lives, it has to do with our commitments and our lifestyle. Now, in 1 Timothy 6:9, we read this. People who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. I want you to think about that. People who want to be rich. Well, people want to be rich. What do you mean by you want to be rich? Well, if you want to be rich, you have to drive a certain kind of car. And if you want to be rich, you have to have a certain kind of house. And if you want to be rich, you certainly have to have a boat. And if you want to be rich, you've got to have a summer home up in Grand Traverse. And you've got to. And when you begin to think about how much you have to earn to not just acquire, but to maintain, people who have those desires often throw themselves into, the scripture calls it ruin and destruction. We call it bankruptcy. Just because of their desires. When if their life would be just a little more simple, it'd be a whole lot less stressful. Okay? Now, we're talking about that as Christians, we have one center, one focus. And Jesus defined it best in Matthew 6:33, where after he has been talking about consider the lilies, consider the birds, consider all of this, he says this as to finally do it. He says, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these will be given to you as well. What's the Christian center? Christ. Seek the kingdom. That's where everything is centered. Why do you go to work? Well, because it's kingdom business. Why do you have family gatherings? Because it's kingdom business. Why do you go to church? It's kingdom business. Why did you get married? Because it's kingdom business. Right? You know, that focus on the kingdom and his righteousness then allows all this other stuff to fall into place and take its proper place. And it allows us to refuse certain commitments. It gives us the freedom not to have to please everybody. That center of his kingdom. Now, the rich worry about the accumulation of things, and while we usually apply it to amassing wealth, most of us don't really intend to become Bill Gates. We don't want to be super wealthy. It reminds me of a story. Years ago, a man and woman got married. When they got married, he wanted to get rich, and she wanted to be comfortable. He got rich, and she isn't comfortable yet. Please laugh. But that's kind of the way we are. We don't want to have a bunch of wealth. We just want to be comfortable, and we just want more and want more. We want to acquire more things. That's what brings us to the tension of Christmas. Okay? Here at Christmas, this is a celebration that involves the invitation of our Lord, who gave us the most extravagant gift in the world ever to be given, that most extravagant gift because he loved us. That gift was his presence. Amen. And so, when we come to celebrate Christmas, we want to use extravagant giving. You just heard me talk about, the big gift, the whatever we're going to do on that extravagant. We want to imitate our Heavenly Father. As disciples, that's what we're supposed to be doing, correct? Huh? We want to imitate him. And he is an extravagant giver. And so we want to imitate him, and we also want to express our love. Gift giving is one of the 5 love languages. Okay? And when we give gifts, we want to say, I really love you. Okay? Well, now that's cool, except that There is a difference between giving out of love and giving out of obligation. There's a difference between going beyond our means to give an extravagant gift and giving what extravagance as a relative thing is extravagant for our means. I remember reading, as a kid, we had this thing called bedtime stories. I don't know how many of your mom read bedtime stories to you. There's a story in there that always intrigued me about a family, a single mom, 2 kids, and was really poor, and there wasn't supposed to be anything for Christmas. And yet God blessed them, and for Christmas they each got an orange and a candy cane. And they were thrilled at the extravagance of their big presents. Too often, we measure extravagance by the amount. Jack Hyles once said, "Pastors, when receiving gifts, be sure to contemplate the small gift." And I can tell you, some of the biggest presents I have ever gotten have come in a small wrapper from people who didn't have one nickel to run against another. Simplicity. Simplicity. Advertisers are paying large sums to create desire for their things. We need to return to the manger and look how simply God gave the most incredible gift in history. No pomp, no palace. He just simply gave us a baby that all of us could relate to. I think it's time for us to ask, Father, what extravagance can I give simply to show my love? Help me not to add one more thing to my family's life that would complicate it. Well, we've talked about simplicity, but the other thing we talk about is the virtue of humility. Now, humility is the quality is a quality by which a person considers his own defects and has a humble opinion of him or herself and is willingly submits to God and others for God's sake. What's it mean? I don't know about you folks, but I know my flaws. Okay? And in knowing my flaws and in knowing my ignorance, ain't a whole lot to brag about. Okay? Come on. Why, you're a pastor and no, yeah, okay, so I'm a preacher. Okay, can I tell you that? And the buck will get you a cup of coffee. Now, I'm not denigrating my office. Please don't understand that. What I'm trying to say is that my position, while I appreciate and actually need the respect that comes from all of you, I need that in order to do what I can do. I also don't read my newspaper clippings either, because I know enough about myself to know that there are weaknesses that are there. Furthermore, Jesus certainly deserved better accommodations when he came to earth. But he showed from the beginning, as I got to thinking about this, right from the very beginning, when he was born, he showed that he was not concerned about honor, power, or position. Wasn't on the radar screen. If it wasn't on his, I don't think it ought to be on ours. There are three prominent characteristics of humility, and we will work through these quickly. Meekness, which is willingness to absorb an offense. Been around somebody who's got a short fuse, huh? They get mad when they think they're being offended, you know? Kindness or gentleness, treating others with respect and speaking to them pleasantly. Yeah, we're living in a Don Reckles world. The insult seems to be the way to go. I hate it. Christians are humble. They speak to one another nicely. Teachableness. You show me somebody that knows it all, and I'll show you somebody that thinks they got it wired. Did you know a quick story? In my summers during college, I worked at Owens Corning Fiberglass. And what we did, I packed fiberglass bats on the night shift. And it was probably 120 degrees on that floor. And itchy fiberglass, you fill in the blank. Anyhow, one night we had a machine go down and it just started throwing fiberglass decking everywhere. And I mean, it literally piled into the ceiling, which was probably a 30-foot ceiling. And so we had to, those of us who were grunts, had to clean that out. Well, there was a guy who was a mule driver, and I can tell you, he wasn't the brightest bulb on the string. He was just a very simple man, but he was out there and he was throwing those itchy boards on the string. 120 degrees, we're soaked with sweat. He's throwing them. He's just whistling. And he thought he had the best job in the whole world. This college kid learned something that night. And I found out that there isn't a person in the world that can't teach me something. And just because they may be mentally challenged doesn't mean there's something that they can't teach me.
That's right.
Humility is the foundation of all virtues. If you don't have humility, everything else is just a sham. Let me read you a couple quotes. To be humble towards superiors is duty, to peers is courtesy, to inferiors is nobility. Pride slays thanksgiving, but an humble mind is the soil out of which thanks naturally grows. A proud man is seldom a grateful man, for he never thinks he gets as much as he deserves. So, during this Christmas season, as we assemble our manger scenes, let's create in us an emptying of ourselves to be filled with Christ. Amen. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we've spent this morning devotion. And we thank you for the joy that simplicity and humility brings us. We simply ask that you would help us to become better at these virtues. And Father, we'll thank you for it all. We ask it in Jesus' name. I thought we would end. Stand, take your red hymnals.